The applause was a physical force, a wave of sound that crashed against Alexander Sterling and receded, leaving behind an echoing silence that only he could hear. He stood bathed in the warm golden light of the stage, a crystal award, a solid cold weight in his hand, the very picture of success. The Innovator of the Decade award. It was another meaningless trophy for his collection, another piece of polished glass to gather dust in a mansion that felt more like a mausoleum. From the podium he could see them all, a sea of adoring, envious faces. Titans of industry, venture capitalists with predatory smiles, ambitious young entrepreneurs who saw him not as a man, but as a destination. They saw the tailored suit that cost more than their first car, the watch that was a marvel of Swiss engineering, the calm, almost bored expression he had perfected over 2 decades of public appearances. They saw the myth, the legend of Alexander Sterling, the boy genius who built a software empire from a garage and now at 42 commanded a fortune that could alter the fates of nations. They did not see the ghost standing beside him. She was there as she always was in these moments of hollow triumph. Eleanor. Her image flickered at the edge of his vision, not as she was in the end, but as he needed to remember her, 24 years old, her eyes blazing with passion, a smudge of grease on her cheek, holding up a circuit board like it was the most precious jewel in the world. Her voice a phantom whisper only he could perceive, cut through the din of adulation. "Is this what you wanted, Alex? Another monument to your ego while my dream gathers dust?" His smile, a carefully constructed artifice, tightened at the corners. He raised the award in a gesture of acknowledgement, the muscles in his arm rigid. "Thank you," he said, his voice amplified by the microphone, smooth and controlled. "Innovation is never a solitary journey. This belongs to my team." Lies. It was always a solitary journey. His journey had been brutally so since the day he buried her. He could feel a panic attack clawing at the edges of his composure, a familiar tightening in his chest, the cold sweat prickling at his hairline. He needed to get out. He cut his speech short, offered a final regal nod, and descended the stage, shaking hands on autopilot. The touches were fleeting, the faces a blur. Each congratulatory remark, each fawning compliment was a nail being driven into his soul. "Brilliant, Alex. A true visionary. How does it feel to be on top of the world? It feels like drowning," he wanted to scream. "It feels like standing on a mountain of gold and ash." He finally broke free, his security detail parting the crowd like a ship's bow through water. He bypassed the champagne reception, the clinking glasses, and forced laughter grating on his raw nerves. In the marble-floored lobby, his driver, a stoic man named Arthur, was waiting with the door of his custom Rolls-Royce Phantom open. The car was a silent, armored sanctuary, its interior smelling of rich leather and quiet desperation. "Obey Mr. Sterling," Arthur asked, his voice a respectful murmur. Alexander stared out at the rain-slicked streets of the city, a glittering cage of steel and glass. Home. The word was a mockery, a 40,000-square-foot echo chamber on a private hill. "No," he said, the word coming out sharper than he intended. "Drive. Just drive for a while." Arthur nodded, understanding without needing to understand. The car pulled away from the curb, a silent black ghost gliding through the night. The city lights smeared across the tinted windows, abstract paintings of a life Alexander could observe but never truly touch. He loosened his tie, the silk feeling like a noose. Eleanor's ghost sat in the seat opposite him. "Running away again, Alex," she whispered. "You're so good at that." "I did everything I could," he murmured to the empty seat, a madman conversing with a memory. "Did you, or did you just write a check and walk away? You let him destroy me. You let Julian Croft take everything." The name was a shard of ice in his gut. Julian Croft, his former mentor, his greatest rival, the man who had smiled in his face while orchestrating the hostile takeover that crushed Eleanor's revolutionary tech startup, driving her into a despair from which she never returned. Alexander had fought him in the boardroom, a war of numbers and stock prices. He had won, crippling one of Croft's subsidiaries. But it was a hollow victory. It hadn't brought her back. After an hour of aimless driving through the city's arteries, a gnawing emptiness in his stomach mirrored the one in his soul. "Stop here," he commanded suddenly. Arthur pulled over in front of La Lumière, a ridiculously exclusive French restaurant where reservations were made months in advance. Alexander had no reservation, but the maitre d' nearly tripped over himself to welcome him. He didn't go inside. He ordered from a curbside menu designed for clientele, who couldn't be bothered to leave their vehicles. Duck confit, truffle risotto, a bottle of wine he would never open. It was a ritual, this purchasing of exquisite food he had no appetite for. A way to pretend he was engaging with the world. Carrying the heavy, fragrant bag, he dismissed Arthur for the night. "I'll walk from here. It's only a few blocks." "Sir, it's not the safest." "I need the air," Alexander said, a tone of finality in his voice. He walked the cold November air, a welcome shock to his system. The clicking of his handmade Italian leather shoes on the wet pavement was the only sound accompanying his thoughts. This was his neighborhood, a manicured enclave of old money and new tech billionaires. The silence here was different, a curated, sterile quiet. The trees were perfectly trimmed, the stone walls of the estates imposing. There was no life here, only existence. He stopped at a small private parquet, a little patch of green wedged between two mansions. He sat on a cold stone bench, placing the bag of food beside him. He wouldn't go home yet. He couldn't face the silence. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through market data, seeking refuge in the cold, hard logic of numbers. That's when he sensed it. A flicker of movement in his periphery. He looked up, his senses honed by years of corporate warfare instantly on alert. A figure emerged from the deep shadows of an overgrown hedge. A boy. He couldn't have been more than 12, rail thin, in a jacket that was no match for the autumn chill. His face was sharp, intelligent, and etched with a desperation that was startling in its intensity. His eyes, wide and dark, were fixed on the bag of food. They stared at each other for a long moment. The billionaire and the street urchin. Two solitary beings from different universes meeting in the quiet darkness. Alexander felt a strange pang, not of fear, but of recognition. There was a fire in the boy's eyes, a defiant spark that reminded him of Eleanor. The boy took a hesitant step forward. "Mister," he began, his voice raspy, "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm really hungry." Alexander remained silent. He should have called security. He should have told the boy to get lost, to go to a shelter. But the words wouldn't form. He saw the frayed cuffs of the boy's jeans, the duct tape holding one of his sneakers together. The boy's gaze darted from Alexander's face to the bag and back again. He misinterpreted the silence as a threat. In a flash of movement, he lunged not for the food, but for the slim leather briefcase Alexander had placed on the bench. It contained nothing of true value, just some quarterly reports and a tablet. To the boy, the polished leather must have screamed money. "Hey!" Alexander shouted, surprised by the boy's audacity. He shot to his feet. The boy was fast. He snatched the briefcase and bolted not back towards the well-lit main street, but down a narrow alley that led to the abandoned industrial sector, a cancerous blight on the edge of their pristine neighborhood. A primal instinct took over. It wasn't about the briefcase. It was about the boy's defiant eyes, the echo of his sister's ghost, the sudden violent intrusion of raw, messy life into his sterile world. Alexander ran. He was in good shape, but the boy moved with the frantic, wiry energy of a cornered animal. They raced through the alley, the sounds of their footsteps echoing off the brick walls. The alley opened into a wasteland of rust and concrete. Skeletons of warehouses loomed against the night sky, their windows like vacant eyes. The air grew thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. This was a different world, a place where hope came to die. Alexander was closing the distance. He could hear the boy's ragged breaths. He reached out his fingers, brushing the thin fabric of the boy's jacket. The boy stumbled, twisting around to face him. He held the briefcase in front of him like a shield. "Leave me alone!" He panted, his chest heaving. As Alexander grabbed for the briefcase, the boy shoved it back at him with surprising force. Alexander staggered, securing his grip on the handle. At the same time, the boy stumbled backward over a loose pile of debris. Something small and metallic tumbled from the pocket of his worn jacket, clattering unnoticed onto the grimy concrete. In the same motion, the boy's hand brushed against the side mesh pocket of the briefcase, his fingers snagging on a small portable power bank Alexander kept there. It was almost identical in size and shape to the object he had dropped. In the panic and darkness, his hand closed around it, and he shoved it deep into his pocket, assuming it was his own. The entire exchange took less than 2 seconds. A chaotic, desperate ballet in the dark. Before Alexander could say a word, the boy was up again, scrambling away, disappearing into the labyrinthine shadows of a derelict factory. Alexander stood alone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked down at the briefcase in his hand, then into the oppressive darkness where the boy had vanished. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a profound sense of unease. He should turn back, return to his world of clean lines and predictable outcomes. He should go home to his empty mansion and eat his cold, expensive dinner. But he couldn't. The image of the boy's desperate eyes was burned into his mind. And something else, a feeling he couldn't name, pulled him forward. It was the ghost of his sister, her whisper urging him on. "Don't walk away this time, Alex. Don't you dare walk away." Taking a breath, Alexander Sterling adjusted his grip on the briefcase and took a step into the darkness, following the ghost of a boy into the ruins of the forgotten world. The factory was a carcass picked clean by time and scavengers. A gaping hole in the roof let in a sliver of moonlight illuminating a world of rust and ruin. Dust motes danced in the pale beam like tiny sprites in a forgotten tomb. The air was frigid, carrying the metallic tang of corrosion and the musty scent of damp concrete. Every sound was magnified in the cavernous space, the drip of water from a leaky pipe, the scuttling of unseen creatures in the walls, the mournful sigh of the wind through broken window panes. Alexander moved with a caution that felt foreign to him. His world was one of polished boardrooms and climate-controlled environments. Here every step was a potential hazard, a gamble on the stability of the floorboards, a risk of treading on shattered glass. He followed the faint sounds of a hushed voice, a soft, coaxing murmur that was almost lost in the vastness of the building. He rounded a mountain of decaying machinery and saw them. In a small, slightly more sheltered corner, the boy Leo had created a makeshift nest. Flattened cardboard boxes served as a mattress, and a collection of filthy blankets and discarded coats formed a pathetic barrier against the cold. A single flickering candle stub cast long dancing shadows on the wall, lending the scene a Dickensian quality of profound misery. And huddled within the nest of rags was a little girl. She was smaller than Leo, her face pale and waxy in the candlelight. Her dark hair was matted with sweat against her forehead, and a tremor ran through her small frame, a constant violent shiver that the thin blankets could not quell. Her breathing was shallow and ragged, each inhale a painful rasp. Leo was kneeling beside her, wiping her forehead with a piece of cloth he'd dipped in a puddle of rainwater. His earlier defiance was gone, replaced by a tenderness so fierce it was almost painful to watch. "It's okay, Maya," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's just a little cold. I'm here. I'll keep you warm." "Hurts, Leo." The girl mumbled, her eyes fluttering open. They were unfocused, glazed with fever. "My head hurts." "I know. Just try to sleep. When you wake up, I'll have found us something. Something good. Maybe even a chocolate bar." He tried to smile, a heartbreakingly brave attempt that didn't reach his terrified eyes. Alexander stood frozen in the shadows, an unseen spectator to this intimate tableau of love and desperation. The briefcase in his hand suddenly felt obscenely heavy, a symbol of a world so far removed from this reality that it might as well have been on another planet. The sight of the sick child and the boy's desperate attempt to care for her struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was him and Eleanor all over again. The memory surged unbidden and overwhelming. He was a teenager again in their tiny, drafty apartment after their parents' car crash. Eleanor, sick with pneumonia, shivering under every blanket they owned. He remembered the helpless terror, the crushing weight of responsibility, the feeling of being a child forced to be an adult. He remembered stealing medicine from a 24-hour pharmacy, his heart pounding with fear and shame. He had been Leo. Eleanor had been Maya. For a dizzying moment, the past and present merged, and the grief he kept so carefully locked away threatened to overwhelm him. He must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, because Leo's head snapped up. His eyes widened in the darkness, and in an instant the gentle caregiver vanished, replaced by a fierce protector. He scrambled to his feet, placing himself between Alexander and his sister, a small, defiant soldier armed with nothing but his own fear. "Stay back," Leo hissed, his voice trembling but firm. "I gave you your stupid case. What more do you want?" "The girl," Alexander said, his own voice sounding strange and hoarse to his ears. "She's sick. She needs a doctor." "She's fine. She just needs to rest. We don't need anything from you." Leo's words were a shield, but Alexander could see the panic behind them. He knew the girl wasn't fine. He knew that kind of fever. It was the kind that stole people away in the night, if left unchecked. Alexander took a cautious step forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you. I want to help. Everyone says that—" Leo spat, his voice thick with a cynicism that no 12-year-old should possess. "Rich people say, 'Let me help,' and then they call the cops and social services. They split you up. They send you to different places. I'm not letting them take her." "I am not them," Alexander said with a conviction that surprised even himself. "I'm not calling anyone." Before he could continue, a low rumble from outside cut through the silence. The distinct sound of a powerful car engine moving slowly, deliberately. A moment later, beams of light sliced through the grimy windows, sweeping across the factory floor. Leo's face went white with a terror that was different, more profound than his fear of Alexander. He instantly dropped to a crouch, pulling a dirty blanket over Maya, trying to extinguish the candle with his hand, and hissing at her to be quiet. Alexander moved instinctively to the nearest broken window, peering through a crack. A sleek black sedan, the kind that absorbs light rather than reflects it, had parked at the entrance to the industrial park. Its windows were tinted to an illegal degree. Two men emerged. They were large, dressed in dark, functional clothing, and they moved with an efficient, predatory grace. They weren't cops. They weren't social workers. They looked like professional hunters. One of them spoke into a device on his wrist, his voice a low growl that carried on the wind. "Perimeter is clear. They can't have gone far. Search the warehouses. The boss wants the asset retrieved. No witnesses." Asset. The word was cold, impersonal, chilling. They were talking about the hard drive, which meant they were hunting the children. Alexander's mind, a machine built for rapid calculation and strategic planning, went into overdrive. The grief and confusion of moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The equation had changed. This was no longer about a rich man's guilt or a stolen briefcase. This was about survival. He turned back to Leo, who was now holding his terrified, half-conscious sister, his body trembling. The boy's eyes met his across the darkened space. In that shared glance, an unspoken truce was formed. They were no longer adversaries. They were allies against a common deadly threat. "Who are they?" Alexander whispered, his voice urgent. "I don't know." Leo breathed, his eyes glued to the sweeping headlights. They were there. After it happened to my parents. They've been looking for us ever since." There was no time for more questions. The men were separating, one heading towards their building. "There's a maintenance tunnel," Alexander said, his brain cycling through architectural possibilities. "Old factories like this always have them. For steam pipes, electrical." He scanned the floor, his eyes searching for a grate, a manhole, anything. "Over there." Leo pointed with his chin towards a dark corner, a place where the floor was stained with a different kind of grime. They moved quickly and quietly, Leo half carrying, half dragging his sister, who whimpered softly. Alexander was beside them, using his own body to shield them from the windows. They reached the spot Leo had indicated. A heavy iron grate was set into the concrete. It was rusted shut. "It won't budge," Leo grunted, pulling at it with all his might. The footsteps were closer now, crunching on the gravel just outside the main door. Alexander didn't hesitate. He took off his $1,000 suit jacket, folded it several times, and placed it on the floor. He knelt, wedging his fingers under the lip of the grate. He was a man who built his empire with his mind, but he hadn't forgotten the physical labor of his youth. He pulled the muscles in his back and shoulders, screaming in protest. The rusted metal groaned, then shrieked as it gave way, inch by painful inch. Just as the heavy metal door of the warehouse creaked open, Alexander lifted the grate free. "Go," he ordered. Leo slid into the dark opening first, then reached up for his sister. Alexander carefully handed Maya down into the boy's waiting arms. The air that rose from the tunnel was foul thick with the smell of stagnant water and rot. "What about you?" Leo asked, his small face a pale oval in the darkness below. A beam from a powerful flashlight cut through the gloom of the warehouse. "Hello, anyone in here?" a voice called out. "There's a service exit at the far end of this tunnel. It should come out 2 streets over." Alexander whispered, his mind working on a contingency plan. "I'll meet you there. I have to create a diversion." "They'll kill you." "They have to find me first," Alexander replied with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. He slid the grate back into place, leaving just enough of a gap to close it fully from above. He took out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. He had a direct encrypted line to the head of his personal security firm, a former Mossad agent. "Elias," he said softly, his voice calm. "I have a priority 1 situation. I need a silent alarm triggered at the chemical plant on the corner of 5th and Blackwood. Full hazmat response. Make it look like a toxic spill. I need every emergency vehicle in the district there in the next 5 minutes. And I need a discreet extraction at the corner of 3rd and Elm. 1 adult, 2 children. Go now." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Then he picked up a heavy piece of scrap metal and hurled it deep into the opposite end of the factory. It crashed against a stack of empty oil drums with a deafening clang. "Over there!" the man shouted. As the beam of light swung away from his position, Alexander silently slid the grate shut, plunging the tunnel into absolute darkness. He ran, melting into the shadows, a ghost in his own city. He led the hunters on a chase through the decaying industrial park, a deadly game of cat and mouse using his knowledge of the area, gleaned from city planning maps he'd once considered buying for redevelopment. Sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer with astonishing speed. Red and blue lights flashed, painting the derelict buildings in chaotic strobes of color. The diversion was working. The men, realizing their quiet operation was about to be compromised, cursed and retreated to their car, speeding away just as the first fire truck arrived. Alexander circled back, his heart pounding. He made his way to 3rd and Elm, a desolate street lined with boarded-up storefronts. A moment later, Leo emerged from an alley supporting Maya. She was barely conscious. Just then, a nondescript black van pulled up. It wasn't the menacing sedan from before. This one was his. The side door slid open, and Elias, his security chief, looked out. "Get in, sir, now!" They clambered inside. The interior was a stark contrast to the decay outside, filled with high-tech equipment and medical supplies. Elias's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the children, but he said nothing, his training overriding any surprise. He immediately began assessing Maya, checking her pulse, wrapping her in a thermal blanket. "She's burning up," Elias said gravely. "We need to get her to a hospital." "No!" Leo cried out, his fear returning. "No hospitals. They'll find us there. They'll separate us." Alexander looked at the terrified boy and the dangerously sick girl. A hospital was a public place with records and questions. Leo was right. It was a risk. He made a decision. "Not a hospital," he said to Elias. "Take us home. My personal physician is on retainer. Get him to the house. Tell him to bring everything he needs for a pediatric emergency." Elias nodded, relayed the orders, and the van sped off into the night, leaving the industrial wasteland and its sirens behind. They arrived at the gates of his estate an hour later. The mansion loomed on the hill, a fortress of light and glass, every window glowing. As they stepped out of the van and into the grand marble-floored foyer, the sheer scale of the place seemed to suck the air from the children's lungs. A sweeping staircase, a chandelier that looked like a captured constellation art on the walls that was worth more than entire city blocks. The doctor was already there, a whirlwind of calm efficiency. Maya was gently whisked away to a guest suite that was larger than any apartment Leo had ever lived in, transformed in minutes into a state-of-the-art medical room. Leo stood alone in the center of the vast foyer, looking small and lost. He clutched the strap of a worn backpack to his chest, his eyes darting around, taking in the impossible luxury. He looked like a wild creature brought into a gilded cage, poised to bolt at any moment. His suspicion had returned stronger than ever. This place wasn't a sanctuary. It was a different kind of trap. Alexander approached him, shrugging off his now filthy, torn dress shirt. "She will be okay," he said quietly. "Dr. Evans is the best." Leo didn't look at him. He stared at a massive abstract painting on the wall, a chaotic swirl of colors. "Why," he asked, his voice barely a whisper, "why are you doing this?" It was the same question Alexander had been asking himself. He looked at the boy, this stranger who had crashed into his life, bringing with him danger and a torrent of painful memories. And he found to his own surprise that he had an answer. Because Alexander said, his gaze distant, fixed on a memory only he could see. "Once upon a time, someone I loved needed help, and I wasn't there for her. I won't make that mistake again." Dawn broke over the estate, a cool gray light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander's study. He hadn't slept. His impeccable suit from the gala lay discarded on a chair, a relic from another lifetime. Dressed in a simple black t-shirt and gray trousers, he sat before a holographic interface, his face illuminated by shifting patterns of light and data. The room was his sanctuary, and his prison, a testament to a mind that never rested. Coffee, black and bitter, sat untouched on his desk. Dr. Evans had left an hour ago with a quiet reassurance. Maya was stable. The fever had broken thanks to the potent combination of antibiotics and intravenous fluids. She was suffering from severe malnutrition and pneumonia, but she would recover. The physical ailments the doctor had noted with a clinical sadness might be the easiest to heal. With Maya's immediate crisis managed, Alexander's focus had shifted to the second anomaly that had crashed into his life, the object now resting on a sterile analysis pad connected to his central server. It was the hard drive. Small, dense, and encased in a ruggedized shell, it felt heavier than it should, as if weighted by the secrets it held. He knew now with certainty what had happened in the alley. In the chaotic exchange, Leo had dropped this drive and in his panic had grabbed the power bank from the briefcase's side pocket. An accidental trade, a twist of fate that had entangled their lives in a way neither could have foreseen. He had tried to access it himself, but the attempt was laughable. His own systems, among the most powerful in the private sector, had been met with a digital wall of impossible complexity. The encryption was multi-layered, polymorphic, and utterly brutal. It wasn't commercial or even standard government grade. It was bespoke, a ghost in the machine designed by a paranoid genius. A video call chimed, and the face of a young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and neon pink hair appeared on one of the floating screens. This was Kaylin, or Nyx, as she was known in the deep web. She was a legend, a digital wraith who could walk through firewalls like they were mist. Alexander had discovered her years ago, a teenager who had breached his company's servers, not for profit, but for the sheer challenge of it. Instead of turning her over to the authorities, he had given her a job, a laboratory, and unlimited resources. "You woke me from a very lovely dream involving a sentient AI and a pot of Earl Grey tea," she said, her voice a dry monotone that contrasted with her vibrant appearance. "This had better be apocalyptic." "It might be," Alexander replied, gesturing to the holographic representation of the drive's file structure, a blood-red fortress of code. "Tell me what you see." Kaylin's eyes widened, the playful apathy vanishing. She leaned closer to her camera, her fingers a blur on her keyboard as she ran remote diagnostics. "Whoa. Okay. That is not a happy little drive. This is art. The architecture is insane. It's layered like a Russian nesting doll, and each layer seems to actively rewrite the one before it. It's quantum-resistant, biometrically locked at a root level, and... Is that a thermite failsafe, Alex? Whatever is on this thing, someone was willing to burn the world down to protect it. "Can you get in?" he asked. She was silent for a full minute, a rare occurrence. Maybe she said finally, but not like kicking down a door. "This needs a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. I'll need to build a custom decryption engine. It will take time, days, maybe longer, and I'll have to do it completely air-gapped. If this thing is as nasty as it looks, connecting it to any network could be... loud." "Do it," Alexander ordered. "Whatever it takes. Spare no expense." The call ended, leaving Alexander alone once more with the silent, menacing drive. Kaylin's assessment confirmed his gut feeling. Leo and Maya were not just runaways. They were the keepers of a secret so dangerous that it had cost their parents their lives, and now had professional hunters on their trail. For the next 2 days, an uneasy truce settled over the mansion. It was no longer an empty monument to wealth, but a high-security hospital wing and a reluctant sanctuary. Elias and a small, discreet team of his best operatives maintained a silent, watchful presence, their faces unreadable, their movements economical. They swept the grounds for bugs, monitored all communications, and turned the estate into a veritable fortress. Maya remained in the guest suite sleeping for most of the day. A private nurse attended to her around the clock. On the few occasions Alexander looked in on her, he saw a fragile doll lost in a sea of silk sheets, her small face peaceful in slumber. Leo was another matter entirely. He was a caged tiger pacing the gilded corridors, his eyes missing nothing. He refused to sleep in the luxurious room prepared for him, choosing instead to stay on a couch outside Maya's door, a self-appointed sentinel. He ate little, speaking only when necessary, his answers clipped and wary. He watched Alexander with a constant, unnerving intensity, as if trying to dissect his motives, searching for the inevitable betrayal he was sure was coming. Alexander tried to bridge the chasm between them, but every attempt was met with a wall of suspicion. He offered Leo games, movies on the home theater system, access to his personal library. The boy refused them all, his only interest being the welfare of his sister. On the third morning, Alexander found the boy in the conservatory, a vast glass room filled with exotic plants and the gentle sound of a recycling waterfall. Leo wasn't looking at the rare orchids or the birds of paradise. He was staring out at the manicured lawns, his expression one of profound loneliness. "How is she today?" Alexander asked gently, keeping his distance. "The nurse says she's better," Leo said without turning. "She ate some soup." "That's good." An awkward silence stretched between them. "This place," Leo said suddenly, his voice quiet. "It's like a museum. Do you even live in all these rooms?" The question was a direct hit, unerring in its accuracy. "No," Alexander admitted. "Most of the time I only use my study, the kitchen, and my bedroom. So what's the point of the rest of it?" "I suppose. I never thought about it," Alexander confessed. It was true. He had built the house as a statement, a monument to his success, but he had never managed to make it a home. It was a fortress for one. Later that day, a breakthrough occurred, not from Kalen's digital excavation, but from a much simpler source. The nurse informed him that Maya was awake and asking for her backpack. It was the same worn bag Leo had been clutching since they arrived. Alexander retrieved it from Leo's post outside the door and brought it to Maya's room. He found her sitting up in bed, looking impossibly small against the mountain of pillows. Her color was better, and the feverish glaze in her eyes was gone, replaced by a shy, watchful intelligence. She looked at him with an expression that was half fear, half curiosity. "Here you are," he said, placing the bag on the bed. She gave him a tiny, hesitant nod of thanks before unzipping a side pocket. She pulled out not a toy, but a worn, spiral-bound sketchbook and a small tin of colored pencils. She opened it on her lap, and all the tension seemed to drain from her small body as she picked up a blue pencil. Alexander was about to leave them to their privacy when he saw the drawing on the open page. It was a rendering of the factory, but not as he had seen it. In her drawing, the broken machinery twisted into monstrous shapes, the shadows were filled with grasping claws, and two small figures huddled in a tiny circle of light in the center. The artistry was raw, untutored, but the emotion it conveyed was staggering. It was a perfect depiction of terror. "You're very talented," he said softly. Maya flinched as if surprised he was still there. She looked down at her drawing, then back at him. She didn't speak, but she didn't close the book either. He took that as an invitation. He stepped closer and pointed to a detail in the corner, a small, intricate pattern on one of the metal monsters. "How did you do that?" "The shading is remarkable." For the first time she spoke to him, her voice a tiny whisper. "I saw it on the side of the big machine. It looked like a sad face." He felt something clench in his chest. She wasn't just drawing what she saw, she was drawing what she felt. He asked very gently, "May I see some of your other drawings?" She hesitated for a moment, then, with a solemnity that was achingly adult. She turned the page. He was not prepared for what he saw. The book was a visual diary of their life on the run. There were dark, chaotic drawings of city alleys that felt like closing traps. A picture of a train station where all the people were faceless blurs, except for two small children holding hands. A drawing of a man's face seen only from the chin up his mouth, twisted into a cruel smile. Then she turned to a page that made him stop breathing. It was a portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, her dark hair tied back. She was holding a sunflower. Beside her was a man with glasses looking at her with an expression of pure adoration. The drawing was filled with light and love, a stark contrast to the darkness of the other pages. "My mama and papa," Maya whispered, her finger tracing the woman's face. And on the next page, the final drawing. The same man and woman, but this time they were lying on the ground, their forms indistinct, surrounded by a violent explosion of red and black pencil strokes. It was a child's attempt to process an unspeakable horror. Alexander felt the ghost of his own sister rush back into the room with the force of a gale. Eleanor had been the artist in their family. Before the code, before the circuit boards, there had been sketchbooks filled with fantastical creatures and beautiful, impossible landscapes. She had drawn to make sense of the world, to escape its harshness. He had forgotten that part of her, buried it under the memory of the driven, obsessive innovator she had become. Looking at Maya's drawings, he felt as if he was seeing a piece of his sister's soul, reborn in this small, traumatized child. He cleared his throat, fighting back an emotion so powerful it threatened to choke him. "They're beautiful, Maya. You have a gift. Just like someone I once knew." He left the room, his carefully constructed composure shattered. He walked directly to his study and locked the door. He went to a safe hidden behind a bookshelf and pulled out a worn leather portfolio. He opened it for the first time in years. Inside were Eleanor's drawings, the ones he had saved from their childhood. The style was different, but the spirit, the raw expressive talent was the same. The connection was undeniable, a promise echoing across the years. He had failed to protect one artist. He would not fail another. He knew what he had to do. He found Leo in the kitchen, warily accepting a sandwich from the household chef. "We need to talk," Alexander said, his voice quiet but firm. "Now." He led the boy to his study. He gestured for him to sit, but Leo remained standing. His arms crossed, his jaw set. Alexander didn't sit either. He stood by the window looking out at his perfect empty garden. "I know what was on the hard drive." Alexander began a calculated bluff. Leo's eyes narrowed. "You're lying. It's impossible. No one can open it." "I don't need to open it to know what it is," Alexander countered, turning to face him. "It's a motive for murder. It's the reason those men were hunting you. It's the reason your parents are dead." He let the words hang in the air. "I saw Maya's drawings, Leo." The boy flinched, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "You had no right." "I had every right. She is a guest in my house, a child I am protecting, just as you are. But I can't protect you from a ghost. I need a name. Who are you running from?" Leo stared at him, his young face a mask of conflict. The instinct to protect his secrets warred with the desperate childish need to trust someone, to share the burden that was crushing him. "Why should I trust you?" Leo demanded, his voice rising. "You're one of them. Rich, powerful. You live in a place like this. My dad wrote about people like you. People who buy and sell the world and don't care who gets hurt. Your father was a journalist." Alexander stated, not as a question. Leo's silence was his confirmation. "They were good people." Leo finally whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "They helped people. They wrote the truth. They found something big, about a man, a very powerful man. They said he was a monster, that he built his company on secrets and lies. They collected everything, all the proof. It was their life's work. It was all on that drive." His small fists were clenched. "We were supposed to leave. We had plane tickets. But they came. The men in the black car. There was a fire, an explosion. Everyone said it was an accident. But I know it wasn't. I heard them talking to my dad on the phone before. They told him to give it back." Alexander felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. It was all clicking into place. The professional hunters, the bespoke encryption, the children of murdered journalists. "Leo," Alexander said, his voice low and steady. "I need the name of the man your parents were investigating. It is the only thing that will keep you and Maya safe." Leo looked into Alexander's eyes, searching, pleading. He saw the cold exterior of the billionaire, but for the first time he also saw the pain behind it, the echo of a grief that mirrored his own. He saw the man who had pulled him from the darkness, who had brought a doctor for his sister, who had looked at her drawings with something other than pity. He took a breath and made a choice. "Croft." He said the name, leaving his lips like a curse. "His name is Julian Croft. Julian Croft." The name hung in the air of the study, an invisible poison. For Leo, it was the name of the monster that had devoured his family. For Alexander, it was a key that unlocked a Pandora's box of betrayal, grief, and unresolved fury. The moment Leo spoke the name, the disparate, chaotic events of the past few days snapped into a terrifyingly clear focus. This was not a random tragedy he had stumbled into. He had been pulled back into the orbit of the only man on Earth he truly hated. "Leave us," Alexander said to Elias, who had been standing guard by the door. His voice was dangerously calm. Elias gave Leo a searching look, then nodded and closed the study doors, leaving them in complete privacy. Alexander walked to his desk and initiated a lockdown protocol. Steel shutters descended over the armored windows, plunging the room into an artificial twilight, illuminated only by the glow of his monitors. He looked at Leo, the boy who had unknowingly brought the war to his doorstep. "Tell me everything you remember," Alexander said. "Every word your parents said about him. Every name you heard. Don't leave anything out." For the next hour, Leo talked. He spoke of hushed late-night arguments between his parents, of names of offshore banks whispered like curses, Cayman, Zurich, Panama. He described a map he'd seen in his father's office covered in a web of red string that connected Croft's legitimate businesses to a shadowy network of shell corporations. He remembered his mother crying after a phone call saying that Croft was a serpent in a $1,000 suit. Most importantly, he recalled his father Daniel mentioning a project codenamed Icarus, something Croft had stolen and buried years ago, calling it the original sin of his empire. Icarus. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. Icarus was the name of Eleanor's startup. It was her life's work, a revolutionary neural interface technology that promised to redefine human-computer interaction. It was the tech Julian Croft's company had acquired in the hostile takeover, only to publicly dismantle it, claiming it was unstable and commercially unviable. They had called her a fraud, a dreamer whose ambition outstripped her talent. The public humiliation had been the final blow. He didn't bury it. Alexander whispered, a horrifying realization dawning on him. He stole it. It was all there. The puzzle pieces of his past and Leo's present were not just related. They were the same damn puzzle. Croft hadn't just destroyed Eleanor to eliminate a competitor. He had done it to steal her genius. And Leo's parents, Daniel and Alina, had discovered the truth. As if on cue, Kaylin's face appeared on his main screen, this time unannounced. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were alight with the thrill of victory. "I'm in," she said, her voice a triumphant rasp. "Past the first gate, anyway. Alex, this thing. It's not just a hard drive. It's a goddamn confession. It's a meticulously organized archive of a 20-year criminal career. I've never seen anything like it. It's got everything: transaction logs, encrypted communications, audio files, blueprints." "What have you found?" Alexander asked, his voice tight. "Easier to ask what I haven't. I'm looking at laundered money trails that lead to senators' blackmail material on federal judges, schematics for illegal weapons tech sold to rogue states. But that's the small stuff. The main directories are still locked, but the file headers on this first layer tell a story. There are project files. One of them is labeled Project Icarus." Alexander's hands clenched into fists on the surface of his desk. "Send it to me. All of it. Now." "Transferring to your secure server," Kaylin confirmed. "Be careful, Alex. The man who built this doesn't just have skeletons in his closet. He has a private cemetery." The data flooded Alexander's system, a torrent of digital poison. He and Leo watched as the files organized themselves on the holographic display, branching diagrams of shell corporations, timelines of stock manipulation, photographs of clandestine meetings. It was the secret history of Julian Croft, a monument to avarice and ruthlessness. Alexander's mind flashed back to his first meeting with Julian. He had been a brilliant but arrogant programmer in his early 20s. Julian, already a legend in the venture capital world, had seen something in him. He had taken Alexander under his wing, molding him, teaching him the brutal art of corporate warfare. Julian was charming, impossibly charismatic, with a philosopher's vocabulary and a shark's instincts. He quoted Marcus Aurelius in one breath and orchestrated a corporate decapitation in the next. He had been a father figure to Alexander, the one who had taught him the rules of the game. He had also been the one to introduce Alexander to Eleanor's work, praising her genius, encouraging him to fund her. He saw it now. It had all been a long, calculated gambit. He had used Alexander's love for his sister as a tool, encouraging her, funding her, only to swoop in and steal her life's work when it was complete. He had played him from the very beginning. He navigated to the Icarus folder. Inside was a single, heavily encrypted audio file and a series of subfolders. He recognized the encryption on the audio file. It was Eleanor's. It was her last gift or her last curse. But the subfolders were accessible. He opened one. Inside were internal memos from Croft's R&D department, dated just weeks after they had acquired and publicly dismantled Icarus. The memos detailed a plan to reverse engineer Eleanor's technology, rebrand it, and integrate it into Croft's secretive military contracts division. There were financial projections valuing the stolen tech in the hundreds of billions. It was all there in black and white. The ruthless efficiency of the theft, the casual dismissal of his sister's life. He didn't just ruin her. Alexander said, his voice a low growl of pure hatred. He erased her. He stood on her grave to build his empire. Leo, who had been watching the data stream with a horrified fascination, pointed to a different file. It was a surveillance report. "That's my dad's name. Daniel Ramirez." Alexander opened it. It was a complete dossier on Leo's parents, compiled over a year. It detailed their investigation, their sources, their movements. The last entry was dated the day before their deaths. It was a single sentence: Subject Ramirez has located the source code. Compromise is imminent. Recommend final sanction. Final sanction, a corporate euphemism for murder. The cold, clinical evil of it was absolute. Croft hadn't acted in a fit of rage. He had signed a death warrant as casually as he would sign a purchase order. Alexander finally understood the depth of the monster they were facing. Julian Croft didn't see people. He saw assets and liabilities, threats to be neutralized. Leo and Maya weren't just children who had lost their parents. They were loose ends. Suddenly, a series of urgent alarms blared through the study. Red warning icons flashed across his monitors. "What is that?" Leo asked, startled. "We're under attack," Alexander said, his fingers flying across his keyboard. But this wasn't a physical assault. It was digital, and it wasn't aimed at the mansion. It was a surgical strike. A custom-built worm was tearing through the firewall of Sterling Horizons, his aerospace subsidiary. It wasn't a smash and grab. It wasn't trying to steal data. It was methodically and maliciously corrupting research data for a next-generation satellite guidance system. Years of work being turned into digital garbage. Simultaneously, his private stockbroker was on another line, his voice frantic. "Alex, what the hell is going on? Someone just initiated a massive short sell on Sterling Horizons, timed with a fabricated news leak about a catastrophic failure in your primary thruster design. The stock is plummeting. We've lost 9% in under 10 minutes. That's a $12 billion paper loss." Alexander stared at the cascading red numbers of his company's stock value and the diagnostics of the data breach. The attack was brilliant. It was elegant. It was devastatingly effective. It was undeniably Julian's style. It was a shot across the bow, a demonstration of power. It was a message. "I know you have the drive. I know you're looking. See how easily I can reach out and touch you. See how much I can make you bleed without ever laying a hand on you. This is just a taste. Send the children, and the drive to me, or the next attack will not be on your company. It will be on your life." The message was not delivered in words, but in the cold, hard language of power that both men understood perfectly. The Cold War had just ended. The real war had just begun. Alexander silenced the alarms. He looked at the chaos on his screens, the billions of dollars of his life's work evaporating into thin air. He felt a strange cold calm settle over him. The grief that had crippled him for years was crystallizing, hardening into something else. It was no longer a weight that held him down. It was fuel. He looked over at Leo, who was watching him, his young face pale with fear, but also with a glimmer of nascent resolve. This boy had lost everything to Croft. His sister Maya, sleeping down the hall, carried the trauma in her art. They had been fighting this battle alone, running in the dark. Not anymore. "He's bold," Alexander said almost to himself. "He thinks I'm still the man he knew, the man who would cut his losses and retreat." He turned his chair to fully face Leo. The last vestiges of the aloof, haunted billionaire were gone. In his place was the ruthless strategist Croft himself had created, but now animated by a purpose beyond profit. "He's made two mistakes," Alexander said, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction. "First, he left evidence, and second, he left survivors." He met Leo's gaze. "He wants a war. We'll give him one." Julian Croft's digital assault was not an attack. It was a declaration. And Alexander Sterling answered it not with a counterstrike, but with the silent, overwhelming force of his resources. The $12 billion loss was a flesh wound, painful but not debilitating. The true damage was the violation, the casual demonstration of his vulnerability, that Alexander would not tolerate. Within hours, the mansion transformed. It had always been a fortress, but one designed to keep the world out to preserve his solitude. Now it became a command center, a bastion designed to fight a war. Elias's team, a dozen of the best private security operators in the world, moved in. They were ghosts in tactical gear, their presence felt but rarely seen. They established a multi-layered perimeter, deploying thermal sensors, seismic detectors, and drone patrols that blanketed the estate and the surrounding woods. The mansion itself was hardened. Windows were reinforced with transparent polymer, and every entry point was placed under biometric lockdown. The most significant changes happened in the digital realm. Alexander's study became the heart of the operation. He and Kalen worked remotely, building a new, completely isolated network for their investigation, a digital island cut off from the rest of the world. All data from the Croft drive was migrated to this new sanctuary. Alexander severed the mansion's connection to the public internet grid, switching to a private encrypted satellite uplink that bounced its signal through a series of anonymous relays he owned across the globe. The glass house had become an electronic bunker. He knew he couldn't shield the children from the new reality. To lie to them would be a betrayal far worse than anything Croft could inflict. He found them in the media room, huddled together on a vast leather sofa, watching an animated movie on a screen the size of a billboard. The domestic scene was so jarringly normal it felt surreal. He turned off the film. The sudden silence felt heavy. Two pairs of young, anxious eyes turned to him. Things are going to be different for a while, he began, choosing his words with care. He sat on the ottoman facing them, making himself smaller, less imposing. The man who hurt your parents, Julian Croft, he knows you are here with me. He sent a message. He explained the cyber attack in the simplest terms possible, not as a financial loss, but as a threat. He is trying to scare us. He wants me to give you and the drive to him. That is not going to happen. Ever. He looked from Leo's tense face to Maya's fearful one. This house is now the safest place on earth for you. But we are in a fight. I need you to understand that. I need you to be my partners in this. Leo's chin jutted out, his fear overlaid with a fierce resolve. What do we do? For now, we learn everything we can about him. We use what your parents left us to find a weakness. Kaylin is working on the drive, but it's a slow process. Your parents' work? It's the key. You knew them better than anyone. You might see things in the data that we would miss. Maya, who had been silent, clutched a pillow to her chest. Will the bad men come back? She whispered. Alexander met her gaze, and the force of his conviction was absolute. If they do, he said, his voice a low, steady promise, they will not get inside. I will not let anyone hurt you. In that moment, the final wall of Leo's distrust crumbled. He saw that Alexander's fight was no longer about a ghost from his past. It was about their future. He was not a rich man playing savior. He was a general defending his people. From that day on, Leo became Alexander's shadow. He proved to be an invaluable asset. His memory was sharp, his mind analytical. He would sit for hours with Alexander in the study, looking at the decrypted fragments of his parents' investigation. He would recognize a name, an address, a seemingly random string of numbers that turned out to be an account password. His parents had used a private code, a shorthand of family jokes and shared memories to annotate their most sensitive files. Operation Sandbox, Leo would say, pointing at a file header. That's what Dad called my first attempt at building a treehouse. He was talking about a construction company Croft was using to launder money in Dubai. Slowly, with Leo's help, they began to chart the vast ocean of Croft's criminality. It was a painstaking, exhausting process, a descent into a world of pure, calculated evil. Amidst the tension, a strange and fragile domesticity began to bloom within the sterile walls of the mansion. Alexander realized that protecting the children was not just about security systems and data encryption. It was about preserving their childhood, what was left of it. He enrolled them in a prestigious, fully accredited online school, setting up a dedicated classroom for them in a sunlit wing of the house. He found himself doing things he hadn't done in 20 years, things he never thought he would do. He learned that Maya, despite her trauma, had a sweet tooth for strawberry ice cream and would only sleep if one particular lamp was left on in the hall. He would sit with her in the evenings, not talking much, but simply being present while she worked in her sketchbook. He saw the darkness in her drawings slowly recede, the monstrous shapes replaced by tentative flowers, the grasping claws by tree branches. With Leo, he found a different kind of connection. He recognized the boy's restless, logical mind. One evening, seeing Leo staring intently at a screen of code, Alexander sat down beside him. You want to know how that works? He asked. He started with the basics, showing Leo the simple elegance of a Hello World program. The boy absorbed it with an astonishing speed. Soon they were spending an hour each night on coding lessons. It wasn't just a distraction, it was a legacy. Alexander found himself explaining complex algorithms with a clarity and passion he hadn't felt since he'd tried to explain his own work to Eleanor. In Leo's sharp questions and quick grasp of logic, he saw not only a reflection of his younger self, but the potential of a brilliant mind that deserved a future. One night, after a particularly grueling day of sifting through financial data, Alexander found himself in the main kitchen, making grilled cheese sandwiches at 2 in the morning, a food he hadn't eaten since he was a teenager. Leo was there with him, quietly observing. "My dad used to make these," Leo said softly, breaking the silence. "He always burned them a little." Alexander looked at the perfectly golden sandwich in the pan. He deliberately left it on for another 20 seconds, until the edges were dark and crispy. He slid it onto a plate and passed it to Leo. The boy took a bite, and for a fleeting second he didn't look like a witness or a survivor, just a 12-year-old kid eating a sandwich. "It's good," Leo mumbled through the mouthful, almost as burned as his. A small smile touched Alexander's lips. In this fortress built to fight a monster, they were tentatively building a family. The breakthrough came from the person he least expected. It was a rainy afternoon. The children were in their classroom, supposedly attending a virtual history lesson. Alexander walked by and saw Maya not watching the screen, but completely absorbed in her drawing. She was using charcoal now, a gift from Alexander, and her hands were smudged with black. She was working on a series of animal sketches. He entered quietly, not wanting to disturb her. He looked over her shoulder at her work. She had drawn a lion, a bear, an eagle. And then he saw the one she was working on now. It was a wolf, but drawn in a stark, stylized way. Its head was thrown back in a silent howl, its form composed of sharp, geometric lines. It was less a drawing of an animal and more a symbol, a logo. "That one is very striking," Alexander commented. Maya looked up, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I've seen it before," she said. "A long time ago. It was on a red folder. Papa told me never to touch the red folders." She looked back at the drawing, a flicker of a painful memory in her eyes. "There was a man who came to the house sometimes, to see Papa. He had this on his ring." A cold premonition washed over Alexander. "This man. Do you remember anything else about him?" "He didn't smile," Maya said simply. "His eyes were like a snake's." Alexander's heart began to beat faster. "Maya, this is very important. Can you try to remember where you saw this wolf?" "On the folder," she repeated. "And the ring. And on the back of the neck of one of the men. The night of the fire. When they pulled me out of my room, I saw it. Just for a second." Alexander felt his blood run cold. He took out his phone and snapped a clear picture of the drawing. "Keep drawing, Maya," he said, his voice strained. "You're doing great work." He walked swiftly back to his study, his mind racing. He uploaded the image to his central server and ran it through every visual database he had access to: corporate logos, government insignia, heraldry. For 10 minutes, the system churned. Then a single match appeared on the screen. The stylized wolf was the official insignia of Lupus Holdings. The name meant nothing to him. He ran a corporate search. The company was officially listed as a logistics and risk assessment firm. It had been dissolved 2 years ago. On the surface, it was unremarkable. But Alexander had learned from Leo's parents' files that the surface was always a lie. He cross-referenced the name with the encrypted data from the drive. He hit a keyword match deep within a file labeled Operational Expenses. He instructed Kaylin to prioritize decrypting that sector. An hour later, she broke through. It wasn't a list of expenses. It was a kill ledger. Lupus Holdings was not a logistics firm. It was Julian Croft's private army, his death squad. It was a cutout corporation staffed by ex-Special Forces mercenaries, the men he used for jobs that required absolute secrecy and plausible deniability. Kidnappings, assassinations, corporate espionage of the most violent kind. The ledger listed dates, code names, and payments. And there near the bottom of the list was the final entry. Date March 18. Target Ramirez D&A. Operation Final Sanction. Status complete. A child's innocent memory, a drawing in a sketchbook, had just handed them the murder weapon. They now had the direct, undeniable link between the corporate titan Julian Croft and the violent enforcers who carried out his bloody work. They had the wolf by the tail. Alexander stared at the screen, at the cold, hard proof of what had been done to this family. The fight was no longer about data and money. It had always been about blood, and he knew with chilling certainty that more blood would be spilled before it was over. The wolves were real, and now they knew where their prey was hiding. Julian Croft sat in a leather armchair that was the color of dried blood, swirling a glass of 30-year-old Macallan. He was not in a corporate boardroom, but in the Spartan soundproofed command center of a private airfield outside the city. On a bank of monitors before him, a thermal image of Alexander Sterling's mansion glowed an ethereal green against the black of the night. It was a beacon of warmth and life, a castle of glass and light. An insult. His patience, a resource he had always considered infinite, had evaporated. His digital assault had been a scalpel, a precise and elegant warning. Sterling, however, had not responded with fear and capitulation as expected. He had responded by building a wall. His spies reported a full lockdown, a digital blackout. The man was digging in for a siege. And worse, the drive was still active. Croft's best people had detected the faint encrypted pings of Kalen's decryption engine, a ghost whispering in the satellite streams. They were making progress. Time was no longer a luxury. "He's sentimental," Croft murmured to the man standing in the shadows behind him. The man's name was Beg Marcus, the former commander of Lupus Holdings, a predator with a snake's eyes and a complete absence of conscience. The same man Maya had described. Sterling always was. His sister was his weakness, and now these children. He thinks he can build a fortress around them. He thinks his money and his toys can protect him. It's time to remind him that some problems can only be solved with a hammer. Marcus nodded, his face impassive. "My team is in position. The target's defenses are formidable but not impenetrable. They are designed to repel a direct assault. We will not be direct." "Retrieve my property," Croft ordered, his voice soft but resonant with absolute authority. "Eliminate Sterling. And clean the house. I want no loose ends, Marcus. No stories, no survivors." "Understood," Marcus said, and melted back into the shadows. Croft took a slow sip of his scotch. He felt no anger, no rage. Only the cold, clean satisfaction of a problem being solved. Alexander had been his greatest student. It was a shame he would have to be his final, most permanent lesson. Inside the mansion, the evening routine was in full swing. It was a fragile, precious normalcy that Alexander fought to maintain. He had just finished checking Maya's math homework, and Leo was explaining the plot of a science fiction novel he was reading. For a moment, sitting in the warm light of the family library, the threat of Julian Croft felt a million miles away. Then the world went red. A single, silent alarm flashed on Alexander's custom-made smartwatch. Not a wailing siren, but a discreet, pulsing crimson icon of a wolf's head. It was an alert from the outermost perimeter, a seismic sensor buried half a mile into the surrounding woods. Tier 1 breach. Alexander's face remained a calm mask. He placed a bookmark in Leo's book. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, his voice even. "I have a call to take in my study." Leo's eyes met his, and the boy knew instantly. The casual facade didn't fool him. He had lived with fear for too long. He saw the sudden chilling focus in Alexander's gaze. The moment he was inside the study, Alexander initiated the lockdown. Elias status. "Multiple contacts," Sir Elias's voice came through the comms system, crisp and professional. "Bypass the seismic net and the infrared tripwires. They're moving fast and dark. Drones 5 and 7 are offline, jammed or shot down. This is a professional team. At least 8, possibly 10. Code Cerberus," Alexander said, his voice dropping an octave. Throughout the mansion, the transformation was instantaneous and unnerving. Hidden steel shutters slammed down over every window, sealing them in a tomb of their own making. Internal doors slid shut and locked, partitioning the house into secure zones. The soft, warm lighting was replaced by a sterile blue-white emergency glow. In the library, Leo grabbed Maya's hand. "Come on," he said, pulling her towards the panic room hidden behind a false bookshelf, the designated safe zone Alexander had shown them. "It's a drill, just like Alex showed us." Maya's eyes were wide with terror, but she trusted her brother. They sealed themselves inside the small titanium-reinforced room just as the final lockdown sequence completed. In the study, Alexander stood before his command console. A 3D schematic of the estate dominated the main screen, dotted with the red icons of the intruders. They were moving in a pincer formation, systematically disabling his external security as they advanced. They were good. They knew the standard playbook for high-tech defenses. "They've deployed a localized EMP," Elias reported, trying to fry the central security server. "The server is shielded. It will hold," Alexander said, his fingers dancing across a console. "But they're using the pulse to mask their approach. Activate the countermeasures. Grid sector gamma." Outside, the manicured lawns became a weapon. Sprinkler heads rose from the grass, but instead of water, they sprayed a fine aerosolized mist of a potent, non-lethal neuroagent. It was disorienting, causing nausea and vertigo. On the thermal display, Alexander saw two of the red icons falter, stumbling back. But the others, equipped with filtered breathing masks, pushed through. They reached the house itself. One operative placed a device on the armored glass of the conservatory. A high-frequency pulse shattered the seemingly unbreakable window into 1,000,000 tiny cubes. West Wing breached, Elias confirmed. My team is moving to intercept. Alexander watched the tactical display, his mind a whirlwind of calculations. He was a chess master playing on a board of his own design, but his opponent was ruthless and unpredictable. He controlled the mansion's nervous system, a god in his own machine. He rerouted power-sealed corridors, vented knockout gas into the breached conservatory. He saw 3 more icons go down, overwhelmed by the gas. But the others were relentless. They used a chemical agent to melt the locks on a service entrance, gaining access to the ground floor. They were inside. The fight became a brutal close-quarters game of cat and mouse. Elias and his men, outnumbered but knowing the terrain, engaged the intruders in the long, art-filled corridors. The sounds of suppressed gunfire echoed faintly through the reinforced walls of the study. Alexander watched the green icons of his men and the red icons of the enemy move and clash on the screen. It was a sterile, bloodless representation of a lethal reality happening just a few floors below. Then he saw the flaw in his plan. 4 of the attacking icons had split from the main group. They weren't engaging Elias's team. They were moving methodically towards the central column of the house where the main elevator shafts and service conduits were located. They're not trying to fight us, Alexander realized aloud. They're going for the objective. They're coming for the drive. They're coming for me. He sealed the elevator shafts and flooded the stairwell with gas. But the red icons didn't stop. They disappeared from the main floor plan. Sir, they've vanished, Elias reported, his voice strained. They're not on any sensor. That's impossible. Alexander muttered, his eyes scanning the blueprints. Every inch of the mansion was wired, monitored, tracked. It was then that a small, tinny voice spoke from the comms panel connected to the panic room. Alex. It was Leo. Leo, stay in the room. Do not open the door, Alexander commanded. I know where they went, the boy said, his voice tight with fear, but clear. The dumbwaiter. The old one. The one in the pantry behind the kitchens. Alexander froze. The dumbwaiter. A relic from the original 1920s construction of the mansion. A small hand-cranked lift for sending food up from the main kitchen to the master suite. It was a relic, a charming antique. It wasn't connected to the modern security system. It was a ghost in the mansion's schematics, a blind spot, a perfect analog hole in his digital fortress. The shaft ran directly from the ground floor kitchens up to the private wing, bypassing all the security choke points he had established. It would deposit them less than 50 feet from his study. Elias Alexander's voice was cold steel. They're coming up the dumbwaiter shaft into the main kitchen. Converge on my position. Silent, running. He looked at his screen. He had 2 of Elias's men stationed on his floor. The rest were engaged on the floors below. It would take them minutes to arrive. Minutes he didn't have. The 4 intruders would be on him in less than 60 seconds. He initiated a final desperate command. The study door hissed open. Alexander Sterling, the tech billionaire, the man who fought with code and capital, walked over to a panel disguised as abstract art. He pressed his palm against it. The panel slid open, revealing a small armory. He pulled out a sleek black tactical shotgun, a weapon he'd purchased for a security demonstration and never touched since. It felt alien and heavy in his hands. He took a position behind his large obsidian desk, the weapon resting on its surface aimed at the study door. Through the comms, he could hear the faint scraping sound of the dumbwaiter arriving in the kitchen. He heard the quiet click of the door being forced open. Footsteps, 4 sets moving with practiced stealth down the hall. He saw the shadow of the first man fall across the doorway. The man was a silhouette clad in black, a rifle held at the ready. Alexander's heart hammered in his chest. This was it. The sterile game of chess was over. The violence was here at his door. Then a new sound. A crash from the kitchen, followed by a grunt of pain and a volley of suppressed gunfire, not aimed at him but away from him. Sir, we're engaged, Elias's voice crackled. They took the bait. Alexander's eyes darted to a secondary monitor showing the kitchen security feed, which had just come back online. Elias's team had arrived. They had used a different service corridor one Leo's warning had given them time to access. They had ambushed the ambushers. The tactical display lit up as 3 of the red icons went from active to incapacitated in seconds. The 4th, the leader. Marcus burst through the study door, clearly realizing the trap had sprung. He was fast. He raised his rifle, his snake-like eyes locking onto Alexander. Time seemed to slow down. Alexander saw the muzzle flash, felt the heat of the projectile as it whizzed past his ear to shatter a priceless vase behind him. He didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger on the shotgun. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, a roar of defiance that shook the room. The force of the blast threw Marcus backward out of the study and into the hall. Silence. The only sound was the ringing in Alexander's ears and his own ragged breathing. Elias and his team swarmed the hall. "Suspect down but alive," Elias reported. "The others have been neutralized. We have one prisoner. The rest are retreating. They're pulling back." Alexander slowly lowered the shotgun, his hands trembling with adrenaline. He looked at the chaos on his monitors, the damage to his home, the smoking shotgun in his hands. He had held the line. They had survived. He sank into his chair, the strength leaving his limbs. They had won, but the illusion of safety was shattered forever. The glass fortress had been breached. The war was no longer a thing of data and shadows. It was a thing of blood and gunpowder, and it had been fought on the threshold of his own home. And they had only won because of a forgotten wooden box in a pantry and the sharp eyes of a 12-year-old boy. The silence that followed the siege was more profound and unsettling than the chaos it replaced. The mansion, though physically secure, felt violated. The air was thick with the scent of spent cordite and chemical agents. Elias's team moved with quiet efficiency, patching up the damage, scrubbing away the evidence of the battle, but they couldn't erase the psychic wound. The fortress had been breached. The monster had shown it could reach them. Alexander found Leo and Maya huddled together in the panic room long after the all-clear had been given. Maya was asleep, her face buried in her brother's side, her thumb in her mouth. Leo was wide awake, staring at the steel door, his young face old with a familiar trauma. He held a heavy antique book in his lap, like a shield, a first edition of Moby Dick he'd taken from the library. "It's over," Alexander said softly from the doorway. "They're gone." Leo looked up at him. There was no relief in his eyes, only a grim understanding. "For now," he said. It wasn't a question. The statement hung in the air, a testament to their new reality. There was no after. There was only the brief, tense quiet between storms. Their prisoner, the commander named Marcus, was held in the mansion's wine cellar. It was a cold, subterranean space with thick stone walls now repurposed into a makeshift interrogation cell. When Alexander entered, he found the man conscious, chained to a heavy chair, his face a mask of defiant hatred. It was the man from Maya's memory. The man with the snake's eyes. "You failed." Alexander said, his voice flat. He pulled up a simple wooden stool and sat opposite him, placing a tablet on a nearby wine barrel. Marcus sneered, a trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. "There will be others. Croft doesn't tolerate failure, or loose ends." It was a threat aimed at himself as much as at Alexander. "Julian Croft is a creature of habit," Alexander said, ignoring the posturing. "He values loyalty only as long as it's useful. He's already written you off. Your bank accounts have been emptied. Your family's protection detail has been withdrawn. To him, you no longer exist." He showed Marcus the screen of the tablet displaying real-time proof of Croft's betrayal. A flicker of doubt, of fear crossed the mercenary's face before his training reasserted itself. "Lies. Are they?" Alexander leaned forward. "I know about Lupus Holdings. I know about the ledger. I know about Final Sanction. You murdered 2 innocent journalists, Daniel and Elena Ramirez, in cold blood. You orphaned their children. Children who are now under my protection, sleeping just a few floors above your head." The mercenary's composure finally cracked. A raw, animalistic rage flared in his eyes. They were not innocent. They were thieves, digging into things that were none of their business. "They were telling the truth," Alexander corrected him. "And that is something your boss cannot tolerate. But this isn't about them. This is about you. You are a loose end, Marcus. Croft's greatest liability. What do you think he's planning for you, even if you do escape?" Alexander let the silence stretch, a weapon in itself. He wasn't a torturer. He fought with psychology, with logic. He was dismantling the man's world piece by piece. "He has a contingency." Alexander pressed his voice, a low, confidential murmur. "Something he's terrified of. A final failsafe if everything goes wrong. I saw hints of it in the data, a protocol he's never activated." "What is it?" What is serpent? Marcus flinched, an involuntary, almost imperceptible reaction. But Alexander saw it. He had hit a nerve. The man's loyalty to Croft was a religion, but fear for his own life was a more powerful god. You know nothing, Marcus spat, but the denial was hollow. Tell me what serpent is. Alexander demanded, his voice hardening. And I will give you a new life. A plane, a new identity, enough money to disappear forever. Stay silent and I will leave you for Croft's cleaners to find. And they will find you. The mercenary stared at him, his mind calculating, weighing betrayal against survival. The war in his eyes was fierce. Finally, a low, rasping laugh escaped his lips. You think you're fighting a man? He whispered, a strange, triumphant madness in his gaze. You have no idea. Serpent isn't a plan. It's a ghost. A final kiss. If you ever corner him, truly corner him, he'll make sure you die slow. He'll make you wish you'd just taken a bullet. That's all you get. Now kill me or let me go. A final kiss. The words sent a chill down Alexander's spine. Before he could press further, Marcus lunged forward with a sudden violent spasm, throwing his entire body weight against the chair. There was a sickening crack. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his body went limp. He had used the chair's momentum to snap his own neck. Suicide. The ultimate act of loyalty or of terror. The incident solidified a new grim strategy in Alexander's mind. Croft had failed in a direct assault. He wouldn't try again. His next move would be subtle, insidious. A serpent strike. And Alexander knew he couldn't hide in his fortress forever. To do so would be to cede the world to Croft. He had a company to run, a board of directors to answer to. His disappearance would create a power vacuum that Croft would gleefully exploit. He had to re-engage. He had to walk back into the snake pit. The perfect opportunity, the perfect trap was less than a week away, the annual Foundation for the Arts Gala. It was the single most important philanthropic event of the year. Alexander was not just a guest, he was the chairman. His absence would be unthinkable, a signal to the entire world that something was terribly wrong. He knew Croft would be counting on it. The night of the gala, the air was electric with tension. Elias and his team planned the security with the precision of a military operation. They swept the venue, vetted every employee, and controlled all food and drink that came near Alexander. He would be a king on a poisoned chessboard, and every other piece was a potential threat. The grand ballroom was a dazzling spectacle of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto a sea of couture gowns and tailored tuxedos. The air hummed with polite conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses. To Alexander, it looked like a battlefield. Every smile seemed predatory, every handshake a potential attack. He moved through the crowd with a calm, practiced grace, a mask of bored amusement firmly in place. He adhered strictly to protocol. He drank only from a bottle of water that Elias himself had opened in front of him. He avoided the canapes, politely declining with a smile. He kept his hands in his pockets as much as possible, minimizing physical contact. For 2 hours, nothing happened. The tension was almost unbearable. He began to wonder if he had miscalculated, if Croft's plan was something else entirely. Then it happened. Not with a bang, but with a stumble. A stunningly beautiful woman in a crimson dress, her back to him, tripped on the hem of her gown and fell backward directly into his path. He reacted instinctively, his hands coming up to steady her. "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry," she gasped, turning. Her eyes were wide with embarrassment. She placed a hand on his forearm to steady herself, her touch feather light. "How clumsy of me. Are you all right?" "Perfectly fine," he said, his voice cool. He felt a tiny, almost imperceptible prick on his arm, like a stray bit of static electricity. He barely registered it. His security team was on her in a second, helping her up, assessing her. Their faces calm, but their eyes missing nothing. "Thank you so much," she said breathlessly to Alexander, before allowing a friend to lead her away, melting back into the crowd. The entire incident lasted less than 10 seconds. Elias scanned him with a handheld device. No weapons, no chemical residue, nothing. It was exactly what it appeared to be, an accident. But as Alexander drove home an hour later, the first tendrils of wrongness began to creep in. A faint metallic taste on his tongue, like old pennies. He attributed it to stress. Then a slight numbness in the tips of his left fingers, a pins and needles sensation that was annoying but not alarming. He flexed his hand, trying to shake it out. By the time he stepped into the mansion's foyer, A deep cellular coldness had begun to settle in his bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. He put a hand out to steady himself against the wall and his legs gave way. He slid to the polished marble floor, his briefcase clattering beside him. Elias was at his side instantly. "Sir, what is it?" "Can't breathe right," Alexander gasped. A crushing weight was settling on his chest. My arm. His left arm felt heavy, detached a piece of meat he could no longer control. The world dissolved into a cacophony of panicked voices, the face of his physician, Dr. Evans, swimming above him. He was in his own medical suite machines, beeping a frantic, desperate rhythm. He felt a needle in his arm, the rush of drugs into his system. He drifted in and out of consciousness. In a moment of lucidity, he heard Evans's grim voice. "It's not a cardiac event. His heart is fine. But his blood, his nervous system is under attack. I've never seen anything like it. It's a complex neurotoxin, military grade by the look of it. It's designed to mimic a stroke, but it's shutting him down system by system. There's no standard antidote. I don't know how to stop it." A final kiss. Marcus's words echoed in his fading consciousness. This was it. This was Serpent. Croft hadn't tried to kill him with a bullet. He had sentenced him to death by inches, a slow, terrifying decay. He fought through the fog, marshaling every ounce of his remaining will. He could not die. Not yet. He had to see this through. "Leo," he croaked, his voice a dry whisper. "He's too weak to speak," he heard the nurse say. "Get Leo," he forced the words out, each one a monumental effort. A moment later, the boy was at his bedside, his face a mask of terror and disbelief. To see this powerful, immovable man laid so low was like watching a mountain crumble. Alexander reached out his hand, shaking, and gripped Leo's arm. His touch was cold. "Listen to me," he rasped, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "There is not much time." He explained it in stark, simple terms. The poison, the limited time, the certainty of what was coming. He saw the boy's eyes fill with tears, but Leo did not cry. He squared his small shoulders, his expression hardening into a mirror of Alexander's own resolve. "Croft thinks he has won." Alexander continued, his breath catching. "He thinks I am out of the game, but he doesn't know about you. You are the piece he cannot see on the board. You are the ghost in his machine." He gave Leo a string of instructions, a final desperate gambit. It was a plan born of a brilliant dying mind, a task that required not strength or wealth, but stealth and invisibility. A mission that only a child, a boy no one would ever suspect, could possibly accomplish. He will be expecting an attack from my company, my lawyers, my security. He will never expect an attack from a 12-year-old boy. Alexander whispered, his strength failing. Everything depends on you now, Leo. My life, your future, justice for your parents, for Eleanor. He squeezed the boy's arm, a final transfer of will of purpose. "Can you do this?" Leo looked at the man in the bed, the man who had become his protector, his mentor, his only hope. He looked at him not as a billionaire, but as the only father he had left. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and nodded, his small frame seeming to grow to fill the immense weight of the task. "Yes," Leo said, his voice clear and steady. "I can." The poison was a relentless tide pulling Alexander further and further from the shore of consciousness. The mansion's medical suite became the new command center, a sterile white room where the battle for a man's life was fought in the quiet hum of monitors and the hiss of an oxygen machine. Dr. Evans and his team worked tirelessly, employing experimental treatments to slow the neurotoxin's inexorable advance. They were buying him time, measured not in days, but in precious fleeting hours of lucidity. During these lucid moments, Alexander's mind was a diamond, hard and brilliant. The physical weakness seemed to strip away all non-essentials, leaving only a core of pure strategic focus. Propped up by pillows and IV line in his arm, he would meet with his two generals, Elias the stoic protector, and Leo the boy who had become the linchpin of their entire war. "Croft will be watching my assets, my corporate movements, my digital footprint." Alexander explained, his voice a weak but steady rasp. "He is expecting a conventional attack, a lawsuit, a data leak to the press. He has insulated himself against those things for decades. We cannot fight him on his terms." The plan he had conceived was audacious in its simplicity, a high-stakes gamble that bypassed technology and corporate power, relying instead on the one thing Croft could never account for: a ghost from his past, powered by a child's love. "Your parents were brilliant," Leo Alexander said, his eyes fixed on the boy. "They were also paranoid in the best possible way. They knew a digital-only archive could be erased or discredited. They created a physical backup, an anchor in the real world. A legacy." From the fragments of data on the drive, Alexander had pieced together the clues. He'd found references to a safety deposit box at a downtown branch of a modest old-world bank, a place so unassuming Croft would never have noticed it. The box was not registered under the name Ramirez. The key Alexander had discovered had been sewn into the lining of Leo's own worn backpack, a place it had been for months waiting to be found. But the final piece of the puzzle, the passphrase needed to access the box alongside the key, was something no hacker could ever find. "They used a name from a book," Alexander said, his gaze softening. "A book they read to you and Maya every night. A story about a secret garden." Leo's eyes widened. The memory buried under layers of trauma surfaced. A worn book with a green cover. A little girl named Mary. A boy named Colin. And their secret society founded under the name of a character from the book they admired most. Mr. Craven. Leo whispered the name, feeling strange on his tongue. But not Mr. They called him Captain Craven. Alexander smiled, a faint, tired expression. "That's it. That's the key. The box is registered to a Captain C. Craven. Only you could have known that." The mission was set. Elias would handle the logistics, but Leo and Leo alone had to walk into the bank. He was to be a 12-year-old boy on an errand for his globe-trotting father, Captain Craven, retrieving a package. He was armed with the key, a forged letter of authorization penned by Alexander's best forger, and the one thing that made him invisible: his age. The next morning, Leo looked at himself in the mirror. He was dressed in new, unremarkable clothes: neat jeans, a blue sweater, clean sneakers. He looked normal. He looked like any other kid. But he felt like a soldier being sent behind enemy lines. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. Maya had hugged him fiercely before he left, making him promise to come back. He had looked her in the eye and promised, and it was the single bravest thing he had ever done. The ride downtown with Elias was silent and tense. The security chief was disguised as a rumpled university professor, complete with tweed jacket and glasses. He didn't offer words of encouragement. Instead, he gave Leo a pair of ordinary-looking earbuds. "One of these is a comms link to me," Elias said, his voice a low murmur. "I will be across the street. I can hear everything. I can see you until you enter the vault. The other earbud is playing a podcast. If anyone asks, you're listening to a show about video games. Do not speak to me unless it is a dire emergency. You are on your own once you walk through those doors. Just a kid on an errand. Remember the story. You've done it 100 times. You are not scared." "But I am scared," Leo thought, his hands clammy. He stepped out of the car and the city swallowed him. The sounds, the smells, the sheer number of people. It was overwhelming after weeks inside the mansion's sterile quiet. He walked towards the bank, a stoic, marble-fronted building that looked like it had been there for a century. He could feel Elias's eyes on him, a guardian angel watching from a coffee shop window. He pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of old paper and polish. A guard gave him a cursory glance and dismissed him. He was just a kid. He approached the counter, his heart pounding so hard he was sure the teller could hear it. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her smile professional but distant. Leo's voice, when it came out, was a little shaky, but he held her gaze. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here for my dad's safety deposit box. He sent me to pick something up." He pushed the key and the forged letter under the glass. The woman read the letter, her brow furrowing slightly. "Captain C. Craven." "Yes, ma'am," Leo said, forcing himself to sound bored, as if this was a tiresome chore. "He's an archaeologist. He's on a dig in Egypt. He sent me for his field notes." The story was plausible enough. The signature on the letter matched the one on the bank's records. The woman nodded, her suspicion abating. "All right. Follow me, please." She led him through a heavy circular vault door that made Leo feel like he was entering the heart of a mountain. The air grew colder. She stopped in front of a wall of small metal doors and inserted her key, then gestured for Leo to use his. He did, his hand trembling slightly. The lock clicked open. The teller pulled out a long, narrow metal box and placed it on a small table in a private viewing cubicle. "Just press the button when you're finished," she said, and closed the curtain, leaving him alone. Leo stared at the box for a long moment, his breath catching in his throat. This was it, his parents' legacy, the reason they had died. He lifted the lid. It wasn't filled with documents as he'd expected. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, were only 3 items. A slim, new-looking data drive, a small leather-bound journal, and an old-fashioned audio cassette tape, the kind he had only ever seen in movies, with a simple white label on it. Written in his mother's elegant script were 2 words, "For Leo." He quickly put all 3 items into his backpack, slid the empty box back into its slot, and pressed the button. The journey out of the bank was a blur. He didn't allow himself to breathe properly until he was back in the car, speeding away from the city center with Elias. He hadn't been a soldier. He'd just been a boy on an errand, and he had succeeded. Back in the mansion's medical suite, the atmosphere was electric. Alexander was awake, his eyes burning with an intense, feverish light. Kaylin was patched in on a secure video link, her usual nonchalance replaced by a sharp focus. They placed the items from the box on a sterile tray. "The journal first," Alexander rasped. Leo opened it. It was his mother's handwriting, page after page of it. It was a diary of their investigation, detailing their first suspicions about Croft, their breakthroughs, their growing terror as they realized the depths of his evil. It was filled with personal asides, her fears for her children, her love for her husband. The last entry was dated the morning of the fire. "Daniel is going to make one last call to Croft. He is going to give him one last chance to do the right thing. I pray he listens. I have a bad feeling about today. If anything happens, everything is in the box. Leo, my brave boy, Maya, my sweet girl, always know that we love you more than words can say. Be good to each other." Leo had to close the book, a wave of grief so powerful it almost knocked him over. He felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. It was Maya, who had slipped into the room, her face pale. She leaned against him, and together they drew strength from each other. "The tape," Alexander said, his voice gentle but firm. "We need to hear it." Elias produced an old cassette player. The technology felt ancient in the hypermodern room. He inserted the tape and pressed play. After a moment of hiss, a man's voice filled the room. It was his father's. "Daniel Ramirez. Julian, you have to stop this. I have everything. Icarus, the money laundering, the sanction orders. I'm giving you one chance. Turn yourself in." A second voice, smoother, colder, filled with an amused arrogance, replied. It was Julian Croft. Daniel. Always the Boy Scout. "You have no idea what game you're playing. You have a lovely family, a talented wife, 2 beautiful children. It would be a tragedy if your crusade resulted in a workplace accident." Leo felt Maya tremble beside him. He could hear the fear in his father's voice, but also his courage. "Daniel Ramirez. Don't you threaten my family. This is bigger than them. It's about Eleanor Sterling. You didn't just ruin her, you murdered her as surely as if you'd held a gun to her head. And for what? For a piece of tech." There was a soft chuckle from Croft. "Eleanor Sterling was a necessary expense. And you, my friend, are about to become one as well. I know where you live, Daniel. I know the schools your children attend. I have the schematics for your building's gas lines. It is a pity, but you leave me no choice. The final sanction, as you so dramatically call it, is already in motion. Goodbye, Daniel." The call ended. The tape hissed for a few more seconds before Elias stopped it. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Maya's soft sob. Leo stood frozen, the monster's voice echoing in his ears. He had just listened to his father's death sentence. The hatred he felt was a pure, cold, white-hot flame. "Kaylin," Alexander said, his voice barely a whisper, his face ashen. "The drive." Kaylin's fingers flew across her keyboard. "The drive from the box. It's not data. It's a key. A one-time decryption slate. It's the final piece. Applying it to the master drive now." On the main screen, the crimson fortress of code they had been chipping away at for weeks suddenly dissolved. A final master directory appeared. It was labeled Aegis. "What is Aegis?" Elias asked. "It's Croft's shield." Kaylin breathed, her eyes wide. "It's a list, not of companies, of people, high-ranking officials, a deputy director at the FBI, a 4-star general at the Pentagon, a handful of federal judges, all on his payroll. This is how he's been untouchable. He doesn't just have money. He owns the system. They had it. All of it. The motive, the murder weapon, the confession, and the conspiracy that had protected him. They had the evidence to burn Julian Croft's world to the ground. As the weight of their victory settled in the room, Alexander gave a shuddering sigh. The immense effort of will that had kept him conscious finally gave out. His eyes, which had been burning with such intensity, glazed over. The monitors beside his bed began to beep with a new, more urgent rhythm as his vital signs plummeted. Alex, Leo cried out, rushing to the bedside. Dr. Evans and the nurses rushed in, pushing everyone else out of the way. He's crashing, get me the atropine. The last thing Alexander saw before the darkness took him completely was Leo's face, a mask of fear transformed by a new, terrible resolve. The torch had not just been passed, it had been seized. The legacy of the whistleblowers now rested on the small shoulders of their son. The hum of the life support machines was the new heartbeat of the mansion. Alexander Sterling lay in a medically induced coma, a desperate measure to protect his brain from the ravages of the neurotoxin, while a team of the world's best toxicologists worked around the clock on an antidote. He was a fallen king, his brilliant mind trapped in a silent, poisoned prison. His absence left a vacuum, a terrifying silence, where his calm, strategic voice used to be. But in that silence, a new leadership was forged. It was a council of four, a strange and desperate alliance. Elias, the stoic soldier. His grief for his friend and employer channeled into a cold, protective fury. Kaylin, the digital phantom. Her playful cynicism burned away by a white-hot rage now personally invested in a war she had only ever seen as a technical challenge. And at the center, two children. Maya, whose nightmares were now fuel for a fierce, quiet resolve, her artwork becoming a source of crucial overlooked details. And Leo. Leo was no longer a boy. The last vestiges of his childhood had been incinerated by the sound of his father's final conversation. He moved through the mansion with a purpose that was unnerving in one so young. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now secondary to the immense weight of the legacies he carried: his parents' quest for truth and Alexander's fight for justice. He looked at the comatose man who had saved him, and he knew that waiting was not an option. The poison was a clock, and it was ticking. We can't just release the data, Kaylin said, her voice sharp over the secure video link. They were gathered in the study, the command center now feeling hollow without its commander. Croft's Aegis network will bury it in an hour. They'll brand it as a fabrication, a corporate espionage tactic by Sterling. We have one shot at this. The reveal has to be undeniable, public, and catastrophic. Their target became clear. In 3 days, Croft International was hosting its annual shareholder meeting. It wasn't just a meeting. It was a carefully choreographed spectacle of power broadcast live on every major financial network in the world. Julian Croft himself would deliver the keynote address. It was his coronation, his moment of ultimate triumph. It would be his execution. The plan they formulated was a hybrid of digital warfare and old-fashioned espionage, a desperate gambit with 1,000 ways to fail. Kaylin would be the architect of the digital attack, building a Trojan horse to hijack the global broadcast. Elias and his team would handle the physical logistics, a symphony of surveillance and diversion. Maya, with her artist's eye for detail, provided the key to the first door. She had been to the Croft Tower on a school trip a year ago, and using her eidetic memory, she sketched a surprisingly detailed layout of the event hall's backstage area, including service corridors and staff-only stairwells that weren't on any public blueprint. And Leo, he was to be the weapon, the delivery system. The main broadcast server is housed in a reinforced room on the sublevel of the auditorium, Kaylin explained, displaying a schematic on the main screen. The signal is routed through there before it goes to the satellite uplink. I can breach the tower's external network, but I can't get past the server room's physical air gap. Someone has to get inside and plug this in. She held up a device the size of a deck of cards. This is a broadcast injector. Once it's connected to their server, it will give me a 30-second window to override the live feed with our own content. With the Croft audio, security will be absolute, Elias stated, his face grim. No one gets near that room. Almost no one, Leo said, his voice quiet but firm. All eyes turned to him. There's a youth choir performing at the opening ceremony, the Voices of Tomorrow. Croft sponsors them. It's a publicity stunt. He pointed to Maya's drawing. They used the same backstage service entrance she drew. The piece clicked into place. He was small. He was unassuming. He could disappear into a crowd of other children. He would be their Trojan horse. The next 72 hours were a blur of intense preparation. Elias drilled Leo on the infiltration route, making him memorize every turn, every security camera blind spot. Kalen taught him how to handle the injector, a simple one-plug operation that felt like arming a bomb. On the day of the meeting, Leo stood backstage at the Croft Tower, dressed in the choir's uniform of a crisp white shirt and black trousers. He felt numb. Elias's voice was a calm, steady presence in his hidden earpiece. Choir is assembling on stage left. In 2 minutes, I will create a diversion at the security checkpoint at the end of your corridor. When you hear the alarm, you have a 90-second window to get to the service stairwell. Go. Leo's heart hammered. He watched the other children laughing and fidgeting blissfully, unaware. He felt a profound, aching loneliness. A moment later, a fire alarm blared at the far end of the hall. Security guards shouted, moving towards the commotion. It was Elias's diversion. Now, Leo. Go now, Elias commanded. Leo slipped away from the group, his small form melting into the manufactured chaos. He pushed through a door marked Staff Only and found himself in the sterile gray corridor from Maya's drawing. He ran his sneakers silent on the polished concrete floor. He followed the route they had practiced 100 times, his mind a mantra of left, right, third door on the left. Meanwhile, miles away, Kaylin sat in the dark of Alexander's study, her fingers a blur. I'm past their primary firewall, she muttered to herself. Sloppy. Very sloppy for a billion-dollar monster. She bypassed layers of security, a digital shark gliding through murky water, getting closer and closer to the broadcast controls. On stage, Julian Croft was in his element. He stood at a sleek minimalist podium bathed in a warm spotlight. His voice, amplified throughout the massive auditorium and broadcast to millions, was a symphony of confidence and power. He spoke of growth, of innovation, of a future shaped by the benevolent hand of Croft International. We are not just a corporation, he said, his arms spread wide in a messianic gesture. We are a promise of a better, more efficient, more secure world. The shareholders, the investors, the world's media, they were mesmerized. He was untouchable, a god of capital. Back in the service corridor, Leo reached his destination, a steel door with a keypad lock. Broadcast control. I'm here, he whispered into his comms. The code is 8159, Elias's voice replied. Security patrol is 30 seconds out, you have to move. Leo's trembling fingers punched in the code. The lock clicked open. He slipped inside, his eyes met with a stunning sight. It was a cold room, the air humming with the sound of dozens of computer servers, their blinking lights a miniature city of data. This was the heart of the beast. He located the main broadcast server, a large black tower with a single open USB port, exactly as Kalen had described. He pulled the injector from his pocket. His hands were slick with sweat. He could hear the heavy footsteps of the approaching patrol in the corridor. He had one chance. He shoved the device into the port. A tiny blue light on the injector began to blink. Device is active. Leo breathed into the comms. I'm in. I see it. Kalen's triumphant voice echoed from his earpiece. I have the handshake. Get out of there, kid. Get out now. Leo slipped back into the hall just as the patrol rounded the corner. He pressed himself into an alcove, his heart threatening to beat its way out of his chest. The guards walked past without a second glance. On stage, Croft was reaching the climax of his speech. The future is not something we wait for, he boomed. It is something we build. It is something we own. Showtime, Kalen whispered in her dark room. She hit the final command. On the 3 massive building-sized screens behind Julian Croft, the sleek corporate logo of Croft International flickered and died. For a second, there was blackness. The audience murmured in confusion. Croft himself faltered, a flicker of annoyance on his perfect face. Then the screens came to life. Not with logos, but with scanned images of financial ledgers. Memos from Lupus Holdings. And then a single grainy audio waveform began to pulse in the center of the screen like a malevolent heartbeat. And then the voice came. His own voice. Cold, arrogant, and utterly damning. Eleanor Sterling was a necessary expense. And you, my friend, are about to become one as well. The final sanction is already in motion. Goodbye, Daniel. A collective gasp went through the auditorium. The sound, raw and unedited, was a sonic bomb that vaporized Croft's carefully constructed reality. The screens shifted again, displaying the Aegis list, the names of generals, judges, and politicians under the heading Croft Payroll, the world stood still. There was no spin. There was no denial. It was the truth delivered like a guillotine. Chaos erupted. People were shouting, screaming. Security tried to cut the feed, but Kalen had locked them out. The audio looping his confession over and over again, a chorus of his own damnation. Croft stood frozen at the podium, his face a bloodless mask of disbelief. The charm, the power, the arrogance had all evaporated in an instant, leaving behind the hollow shell of a man who had just been publicly vivisected. He turned his instincts screaming at him to escape and ran for a private exit backstage. As he shoved through the door, he stopped dead. Standing in the corridor blocking his path was Leo. The boy didn't say a word. He just stood there, his small form radiating an immense silent power. In his eyes, Croft saw not a child, but the ghosts of everyone he had ever destroyed, Daniel, Alina, Eleanor. He was cornered not by an army, but by his own sins, embodied in the unwavering gaze of a 12-year-old boy. That moment of hesitation was all it took. The doors behind him burst open, and federal agents, the honest ones Elias had tipped off, swarmed the stage. "Julian Croft, you are under arrest." They slammed him against the wall, his $1,000 suit twisting in their grip. And as they cuffed his hands behind his back, his eyes were still locked on Leo, the small, silent figure who had just brought down an empire. Checkmate. The fall of Julian Croft was not a quiet event. It was a seismic detonation that sent shockwaves through the foundations of finance, politics, and industry. His public unmasking was so absolute, so undeniable, that not even his powerful corrupt allies in the Aegis network could contain the fallout. In a desperate scramble for self-preservation, the rats began to flee the sinking ship. Names were named, deals were exposed, and a vast, decades-old criminal conspiracy was dragged blinking into the harsh light of day. One of those rats was a brilliant, amoral biochemist who had been on Croft's secret payroll for years. Faced with the choice between a life sentence and a plea deal, he made the logical choice. He gave the federal authorities everything, including the complete formula and synthesis process for a very specific slow-acting neurotoxin and the precise chemical composition of its single complex antidote. The news reached the mansion like a miracle. For days, Dr. Evans and his team worked feverishly synthesizing the life-saving compound. And then, in the quiet of the third day, they administered it. For 24 hours, Alexander's body was racked with a new kind of fever as the antidote waged war with the poison in his cells. Leo and Maya never left his side, holding vigil outside the glass doors of the medical suite. And then, on the morning of the 5th day, the frantic beeping of the machines settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse. His fever broke. A few hours later, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Alexander Sterling opened his eyes. The world swam back into focus slowly. The first thing he saw was not the sterile white ceiling or the blinking medical equipment. It was two faces framed by the morning light pouring in through the window. Leo and Maya. They were asleep in chairs pulled right up to his bedside, Leo's head resting on the edge of the mattress, Maya curled up with her head on her brother's lap. In that moment, they were not soldiers or survivors. They were just children, exhausted and vulnerable. He felt a surge of love so powerful, it was a physical ache in his healing chest. He lifted a hand, a movement that was still weak and tremulous, and gently rested it on Leo's head. The boy stirred his eyes, fluttering open. He saw that Alexander was awake, and his face for the first time in months broke into a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. "Alex," he whispered, his voice thick with sleep. "You're back." That single word, back, held the weight of all their shared fear, their desperate fight, their impossible victory. Alexander couldn't speak, a wave of emotion choking him, but he managed a weak smile in return. He was back, and he was not alone. 6 months later, the world was a different place. The Croft trials, as they came to be known, were a televised spectacle that held the world captive. Julian Croft, stripped of his power and his bespoke suits, was a diminished figure, his charismatic mask replaced by the vacant stare of a sociopath who had finally lost the game. He was found guilty on all counts and would spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. The tendrils of his Aegis network were systematically pruned, leading to the resignations and arrests of some of the most powerful people in the country. But for the inhabitants of the mansion on the hill, the trial was just background noise. Their world was being rebuilt on a new, much stronger foundation. The day the adoption was finalized was a quiet affair. There was no grand party, no press release. There was only a solemn proceeding in a judge's private chambers. By the power vested in me, the judge said, her smile warm and genuine, I hereby declare that you are now a legal family. Congratulations, Mr. Sterling. And congratulations, Leo and Maya Sterling. The name sounded both strange and perfectly right. Outside the courthouse, as they got into the car, Maya, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. Dad. She tested the word, her voice small. Alexander's heart swelled. He turned in his seat to look at his children. His children. Yes, sweetheart. Can we get strawberry ice cream? He let out a laugh, a real unrestrained sound that echoed in the car. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. We can get all the strawberry ice cream in the world, he said. The mansion, once a monument to loneliness, was now a home. The sterile silence was replaced by the sounds of life, the thud of Leo's basketball on the repurposed tennis court, the soft scratching of Maya's charcoal pencils on paper, the chaotic energy of their friends coming over to swim in the pool. The walls were no longer adorned solely with priceless abstract art. Now pride of place over the main fireplace was given to Maya's vibrant, hopeful paintings. The study was no longer a command center, but a place where a father helped his son and daughter with their homework. Alexander, too, was transformed. The poison had left its mark. He was leaner, and there were new lines of exhaustion around his eyes, but the haunted, weary look was gone. It had been replaced by a deep, abiding peace. He had found what his billions could never buy, a reason, a purpose. 2 months after the adoption, he stood once more on a brightly lit stage, but this time it was not to accept a hollow award. It was to make the most important announcement of his life. For many years, he began his voice steady and clear broadcast to the world. My work has been about creating systems. Efficient, powerful, profitable systems. But I have come to learn that without a moral core, without a human purpose, such systems can become monstrous. He announced the formation of a new independent entity funded with half of his personal fortune, the Eleanor Sterling and Ramirez Family Foundation. Its mission was twofold. The Sterling wing would be a tech incubator, unlike any other, a sanctuary for brilliant young innovators like his sister, providing them with funding, and more importantly, with the legal and ethical armor to protect their work from corporate predators. The second half, the Ramirez Grant, would be a multi-billion-dollar endowment to fund and protect independent investigative journalism around the world. It would provide resources, legal support, and protection for reporters like Daniel and Alina Ramirez, who dared to speak truth to power. We cannot allow the brightest lights of one generation to be extinguished by the darkness of another, he concluded. This foundation is not about charity. It is about building a better, safer, more truthful world. It is the legacy of my sister Eleanor. It is the legacy of Daniel and Alina Ramirez. And it is the promise I make to my children, Leo and Maya. It was his checkmate against the ghost of Julian Croft. He wasn't just defeating the man, he was building a world where men like him could no longer thrive. Later that evening, the three of them sat by the large reflecting pool in the garden. The sky was a deep, star-dusted indigo. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that only exists between people who are truly family. Do you think they can see us? Maya asked quietly, her head resting on Alexander's shoulder. She didn't have to say who they were. Alexander looked up at the vast expanse of the night sky. He thought of Eleanor, of her fiery passion. He thought of the brave, loving couple he had never met, but whose legacy he was now sworn to protect. I don't know about seeing, he said softly. But I think they can feel us. I think they know that their work wasn't in vain. I think they know that you are safe and that you are loved. Leo, who had been staring into the dark water, finally looked up. He asked me once what the point of all this was. He said, nodding towards the magnificent house. All the rooms, all the stuff. And what did you tell him? Alexander asked, a gentle smile playing on his lips. I didn't have an answer then, Leo said. But I do now. He looked from his sister to his father, his expression serious and wise beyond his years. The point isn't the house, it's who you share it with. Alexander put his arms around his two children, pulling them close. The gaping hole in his soul, the one that had been carved out by grief all those years ago, was gone. It had been filled not with money or success, but by the fierce, resilient, and unconditional love of these two extraordinary children. In saving them, he had finally truly saved himself. The weary billionaire was gone. In his place was a father looking up at the stars with his family finally at peace. A new dawn was breaking. Wealth is not measured in currency but in connection. Power is not the ability to control others but the strength to protect them. And justice is not merely the punishment of the wicked but the cultivation of a world where goodness can flourish. The deepest wounds we learn are not healed by time but by love. And sometimes the greatest treasures are not the things we acquire, but the family we build in the most unexpected of places. A life's true legacy is written not on stock certificates or in headlines, but in the hearts of those we choose to love. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Stories like these remind us that even in the darkest of times, courage and compassion can light the way. If this story touched your heart, please consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your engagement allows us to continue bringing meaningful narratives to light. We appreciate you spending your time with us and hope to see you again soon.